And I'm just going to go ahead and share the slides here, and we are going to start recording. Building on what Katie was saying, we just wanted to introduce the rest of our team. As Katie mentioned, she's the acting executive director here at Everyone Home. I'm also a staff member with Everyone Home. I'm a data and performance analyst, and we also have Dorcas Chang here, our operations manager, as well as Kate Bristol, who is serving as a consultant this year for the NOFO process, or actually the two NOFO processes. So I'll let Kate introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Bristol. I am a solo consultant. Been working for many decades in the homelessness policy space and have provided technical assistance to some other communities in the Bay Area around the CoC in previous years. This year is my first year in Alameda County working on the NOFO. I'm not working on anybody else's NOFO this time around, just yours. And I'm also happen to live in Alameda County in Oakland, and really excited to be here today. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kate. And while they're not here, we also just wanted to give a thanks to Homebase, who helped develop this training from last year, and we adapted for this year. So I wanted to give a thank you. All right, so in terms of our agenda today, I just wanted to mention right off the bat that this is not the bidders conference for either NOFO. Those are going to be happening next week, and we'll get into the timeline. There's going to be two bidders conferences. So this really is a beginner's orientation. We're really hoping folks who maybe have never applied before or are considering applying for a new project are here today. And we're going to do an overview of what some of these acronyms mean, what the Continuum of Care NOFO means. We're going to talk about project types and eligible participants, eligible costs, some requirements, including some match requirements, and then a couple of tips around program design and some information about the local competition timeline. We're not going to get into much about the local competition process because that's really going to be shared at the bidders conference. So if you have a grant already and are renewing, there might not be anything new for you here. And then we will have time for a Q&A. We've got a great crowd. We're so happy that you're all here. So just wanted to give you a heads up that we might not be able to get to all the questions. We definitely want you to throw questions into the chat. And if we can't get to them all, we'll follow up with a Q&A. So we'd love if you're able to introduce yourself in the chat. You could include your name, pronouns if you want, your organization, and something you're hoping to learn today. And I'll put this in the chat too. So as you're introducing yourself in the chat, so we know a little bit about who's here, I already mentioned, feel free to use the chat for asking questions. You can also raise your hand. We probably will mostly go through our slides and then have more of the Q&A towards the end. So you saw the Zoom poll here, just asking a couple questions about who's here. I'll give you one more moment if you haven't filled out that poll, and we can see a little bit about who's here. Looks like most folks have filled out our poll, so thank you. Seems like it's great. Most people here are not currently receiving Continuum of Care funding, although there's a few of you who are, and many people are considering applying for a new CSE funded project. And in terms of what you're interested in, seems like the majority of people are hoping to learn about both, what we're calling the regular notice of funding opportunity, as well as the supplemental to address unsheltered homelessness. And feel free to keep introducing yourselves in the chat as we go along. But I'm actually going to turn it over to Kate to delve into an overview of this process.
Thanks, Rachel. So as Rachel mentioned, we are going to give a pretty high level kind of overview of this funding source, or the two funding sources in this case, because we have two different NOFOs. And kind of share a little bit about the kinds of projects you can fund, the kinds of costs you can incur, who you can serve, and a few tips. And I think our hope is that if folks could hold their questions to the end, I think that would be probably would be able to get to more questions that way. I'm going to try and run through the slides, not in a rushed way, but sort of leave a decent amount of time at the end for questions. And then again, as Rachel mentioned, we will post a written summary of the Q&A, including questions we answer on the call, and also questions if we're not able to get to them. We'll also answer them in a written Q&A. I just want to reiterate, this isn't the bidders conference, so we can't answer specific questions about the local process or how applications will be evaluated. That'll all come next week in the bidders conferences. And if you have a very technical question about a specific project you're interested in applying for, we might want to, we'll probably ask you to submit that to us separately, but we'll try and answer anything that's sort of generally about the CoC funding source. So starting off with the acronyms, HUD is a word that comes up often, is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they, of course, are the federal agency that releases the Continuum of Care funding stream and sets all the rules governing the use of those funds in alignment with the authorizing legislation for the Continuum of Care. And then NOFO, which is another word we use a lot. Up until last year, it was NOFA with an A at the end, which was Notice of Funding Availability. They've changed it to Notice of Funding Opportunity. I'm not actually sure why that's the case, but now it's a NOFO. And so historically, every year HUD has released this NOFO, which is an annual competition. But this year they've released a second one, which is a new, what they're calling supplemental NOFO, that's specifically around funding projects for unsheltered homelessness. So we've had to come up with some new language to differentiate. So we're calling the annual NOFO the regular, and we're calling the unsheltered NOFO either the unsheltered or the supplemental. So when you hear regular, it might not be a term you're accustomed to hearing in the local competition, but it just means the one that you're familiar with is the regular one. Okay, next slide. And then what is a continuum of care, which is the other kind of common acronym that comes up. It actually has multiple meanings. So a continuum of care is actually a planning body in a community that does the planning work around how the overall system is going to be designed and implemented to reduce homelessness. And so Alameda County, meaning that the county geography, has a continuum of care body, and there are several different planning bodies that govern it. The CoC is also a HUD funding program, and that's what we're talking about today. And then continuum of care also kind of loosely refers to the system of services and housing interventions, both short and long term, for people who experience homelessness. And then this gives you a little bit of an idea of how the funding works. And it's actually even slightly more complicated than what's on this graphic. But so HUD is the initiator of all the funding. So they hold the large bucket of money at the federal level. The money is distributed through continuum of care entities throughout the country. So you'll see here Alameda County CoC is an example. San Francisco has a CoC, Santa Clara has a CoC, all the other states have communities with CoCs. And then individual projects apply and receive funding through their local CoC. The only thing I would just add to this is that just to make things even more complicated, if your project is funded, you don't have a contract with the CoC, you'd actually have a contract directly with HUD. So the lines between the CoC and the project should really kind of be dotted lines. But the only way to apply for and receive funding is through the CoC. But then again, once you're awarded a project, you would actually be contracting directly with HUD. And then this slide tells a little bit more about the two NOFOs, which I already talked about. We have our 2022 CoC regular process, which happens annually. Projects that already have a CoC grant can renew their grant through this process. And then there's a relatively small amount of funding available to fund new projects, which we'll talk about. And then this supplemental NOFO is unique, is a new thing this year. HUD is offering communities the opportunity to compete for a grant that will provide 3 years of funding. All the projects have to be new, and they have to focus on reducing unsheltered homelessness. So this next couple slides talk a little bit about how much money is available. So in the regular competition, there's a lot of kind of HUD terminology and technical terminology, but essentially, if Alameda County's CoC is to renew all of the existing projects that are already funded for 1 year, that would cost about almost $39 million, so $38,944. So that's considered our annual renewal demand. Funding has to be tiered. So this year, only 95% of that is guaranteed to be funded. And again, we'll get into a lot more detail on this in the bidders conference for the regular NOFO. There is bonus funding that can be applied for new projects up to 1.9 million-ish, and also a domestic violence project bonus for 1.2 million. And then there's some numbers, some money available for CoC planning, which only the collaborative applicant can apply for. Because HUD is in a bit of a rush this year, they put out their NOFO a little late and the deadline is a little sooner than normal. We haven't been able to 100% confirm these are the numbers, but if they changed, it would be very minor amounts of dollar amounts. And then on the supplemental side, or the unsheltered NOFO, our county, your CoC can apply for 15 million over 3 years. So a total of $5 million of projects per year. It is not guaranteed. That's just the max we could apply for. It's going to be very competitive nationally. And in addition, because HUD has a requirement that they consider geographic distribution, they can't have all the grants going to one part of the country. So there's a maximum of 10 awards per state, which is a little bit hard for California because we are a big state and have a lot of CoCs. So only 10 of the CoCs in our state would receive these dollars. Okay, I'm going to just stop there for 1 sec. And again, I'm asking if folks can please hold their questions to the end, but if you're dying to ask a question, you absolutely can't hold it. We will take a question there. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to project types and eligible costs. Great.
I don't look like we have any burning questions.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about who can apply and what you can apply for. So the CoC program is pretty broad in terms of eligible entities that can apply. So you can be a nonprofit provider, you can be a state, probably not applicable here. You can be any kind of a local government entity, instrumentalities of state and local governments, which is another way of saying the same thing. Public housing authorities can apply, and new, as of 2021, tribes and tribal entities also can apply for grants. So then we get into these eligible project types. So this is a really important consideration for folks who are considering applying for this funding source if you've never worked with it before. So under what we call the regular NOFO, there's a fairly limited number of kinds of projects you can apply for, and HUD puts a lot of very specific, they're quite specifically defined by HUD. So you have to really think about whether the thing you're considering doing fits into one of the predefined types of projects. And this is just a very high level overview of what they are. That's the sound of my dog digging a hole in the rug. Can you stop? Okay, so permanent supportive housing is housing that for which there are no time limits imposed on the participants, so they can stay in the housing for as long as they so choose. You can do both project-based and scattered site types of projects, and there's a few different ways that you can secure the housing, which we'll get into in another slide. Generally, PSH has to serve people who meet the definition of chronic homelessness. And pretty much all of the kinds of costs that are eligible under the CoC are eligible in PSH. And we're going to cover eligible costs a little bit later in the presentation. You can apply to do rapid rehousing, which is time limited. rental assistance and services up to 24 months. This is a scattered site model in which participants secure housing in the private market and then they receive a rent subsidy. This can serve a broader range of participants. And we'll talk a little bit more about what these homeless definitions mean, but you can serve people who are experiencing literal homelessness. You can serve people who have meet a fairly narrow definition of at risk, and you can serve people fleeing domestic violence. And under this component, you are limited to the kinds of expenses you can have in the project to tenant-based rental assistance, which is what that TBRA stands for, support services, and then you can cover some administrative and HMIS costs. And then the last type is an extremely unusual, and only HUD has ever thought of this type of project, an unusual project type called Joint Transitional PHRRH. And essentially what this is a combination of a transitional housing project with rapid rehousing connected to it. So folks can stay in the transitional housing units, and then they can receive rapid rehousing when they exit. And this is also a 24-month time limit, can be project-based or scattered site, because the transitional housing part can be project-based. Can also serve all the same folks that you could serve in rapid rehousing. And there's a few, you can also incur leasing costs in addition to tenant-based rental assistance. A few more things about this component is you have to offer people both the transitional and the rapid rehousing parts of the project. Participants cannot be required to participate in both. So they could say, I just want the transitional, I just want the rapid, or they could want both. And you have to offer both. Okay. You cannot use CoC dollars for emergency shelter. Support under the regular NOFO, you cannot use it for services not connected to a housing project, except coordinated entry. You cannot use it to fund a new standalone transitional housing project, and you can't use it for homelessness prevention. Okay, so the good news on the supplemental NOFO side, which is, as we mentioned, brand new this year and also has a little bit more money available in it than the regular NOFO for new projects. You can apply to do the three things I just talked about, which is PSH, rapid rehousing, and the joint transitional rapid rehousing. And this is new. Years ago, you used to be able to apply under the regular NOFO to do services only projects, but you haven't been for a long time. Now you can under this. So what you can fund under the supplemental NOFO, coordinated entry projects, which generally wouldn't be applicable for community-based entities and jurisdictional applicants, because the coordinated entry system is run by the county. But the two things in bold are new and really, I think, might be of interest to some of the folks on the call. So you can apply to do a project that is a mobile street outreach to people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And you can also apply for any other kind of project that serves people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness that is just services, not connected to units. And then I think on the next slide, we have a few examples of what that could be. And this is not an exhaustive list, but just to sort of illustrate the idea. You could do a project that's to engage landlords, recruit and engage landlords. You could do an employment kind of project or workforce development services. You could do parking, laundry, showers, or storage. You could do social and community integration. You could do anything that's services designed to meet the needs of people who are unsheltered and in some way help provide some kind of a pathway through to housing. Next slide. Keep an eye on the time. Okay. Under the supplemental NOFO, if you're doing permanent supportive housing, you cannot apply to do new construction, acquisition, or rehab. So that's a difference. In the regular NOFO, if you want to do permanent supportive housing, you can use the dollars for hard costs, but you cannot under the supplemental. And then similar to what we just shared on the regular, you also can't fund emergency shelter, new transitional housing, or homelessness prevention. Okay, next. Okay, eligible participants. The primary target for the regular CoC funding is people who are experiencing literal homelessness, and that has a specific definition in the HUD definitions of homelessness, but generally includes people who are staying in places not meant for people to live, which includes streets, tents, encampments, parks, vehicles, RVs, or abandoned buildings that are not connected to utilities is considered unsheltered. Being in an emergency shelter qualifies you as being experiencing literal homelessness. And then people who are in institutional settings, but are kind of moving from experiencing homelessness in and out of whether it's emergency room or criminal justice setting or a treatment setting. For the unsheltered NOFO, the primary target is folks who are unsheltered, which means that they're staying in encampments, outside tents, parks, cars. It's not generally designed to be targeting folks who are already sheltered in an emergency shelter. Next slide. CoC funding cannot be used to serve people who are housed, or even people we would think of as being unstably housed. So people who are couch surfing or doubling up, who are staying in sober living or room and board situations, or staying in motels paid for, that they're paying for, generally are not eligible participants for this funding source. Next slide. There are some kinds of other eligible clients, so that don't fit what HUD calls the literal homelessness definition, but fit some of the other definitions. So people fleeing domestic violence or to need to leave their home to escape an abuser and do not have other resources can, that is a yes, be served with these funds. And under the regular NOFO side, there is a pot of bonus money for projects that serve this population. They have to be housing projects. There's a limited number of ways you can serve people who are at imminent risk of homelessness, meaning they've been evicted and have nowhere to go and have no other resources. And there's a few other minor exceptions. So one thing we often encourage folks who are thinking about this funding source is if you're largely working with folks who are housed but have housing instability, which we know is a lot of people in the community, this isn't a great funding source for that population, and to consider other sources, which we have some examples on here. And actually we should update, it says HEAP and CASH, we should have updated that to HAP. Okay, you can also serve subpopulations of people with some limits. So just be careful about if you're targeting people with a specific disability type, there are rules around excluding people who have a different disability. All your referrals in the CoC funded projects have to come through the county's coordinated entry system. And if you define a specific subpopulation and there aren't enough people in the coordinated entry system to refer to fill those units, you'll need to be able to take other referrals. So some common subpopulations that are served in these kinds of projects are youth, DV survivors, veterans, and then people with disabilities. And you can target specific disabilities, but just you can target but not exclude folks with specific kinds of disabilities. Okay. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about eligible costs. And Rachel, is there anything I should stop and answer, or are we good?
We have a couple of questions about what could be covered, but I think we will cover some of this as we go. There is one question about whether motel vouchers are eligible under the unsheltered supplemental NOFO.
I believe the answer is no, but we will check. I think motel vouchers are generally considered to be a form of emergency shelter, which is not an eligible use of CoC dollars. Okay, so the other thing about the Continuum of Care program is HUD has a very kind of prescribed set of what they call budget line items, or BLIs. So anything you want to do with their dollars has to fit one of their BLIs. And so we're going to give you kind of a high level overview of that. So you can do capital costs, although again, not under the supplemental, but under the regular. So acquisition, rehab, and new construction is eligible. Generally not a very common use of CoC funds, but it is allowed. Much more common is to use the money for other kinds of housing expenses. Specifically, it's often used for tenant-based rental assistance. And there's a few other kinds of rental assistance, which we'll get to. You can also use it to lease an entire building or units within a building, and you can use it to cover the operations of a structure that you own or lease. And then you can pay for a large number of different kinds of support services. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple more slides. But obviously things like case managers, social workers, housing navigators, and housing search specialists, all different kinds of support services can be funded. You can pay for your program's costs associated with entering data into HMIS, and some administrative and indirect costs are also eligible. Next slide. Okay, so this is a little bit of a breakdown of all the myriad of ways you can use CoC dollars to pay for housing. It gets very technical. And again, I think to the extent that you have a technical question about some of the eligible uses for housing, we will try and answer it, and we may have to go back and research it for you. So you can master lease, where you as the program provider lease housing or some apartments, and then you sublease the units either free or at a very low rate to the participants. It has to be kind of a regular lease with regular lease terms. And you can't really do, unfortunately, it's pretty difficult to do sharing, or so you can't, it's hard to use for something like a group home kind of setting. But it's a fairly common use of CoC dollars to do master leasing. Another really common use is tenant-based rental assistance, which if you're familiar with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is what we now call the Section 8 program, which is the original form of tenant-based rental assistance that HUD invented. This is where clients find units in the private rental market. The client, actually participant, signs a lease with the landlord or the property owner, and then the program provides a rent subsidy to the property owner. The rent has to meet a variety of different kinds of HUD guidelines. So that's tenant-based rental assistance. Again, it's a very common use of CoC dollars. And then some of the other sort of less common uses, as we mentioned, you could build or acquire units on the regular NOFO side. You can use housing that you already own and pay for operating costs and services. And then there's a couple different flavors of rental assistance, which are project-based rental assistance, where you, again, it's a partial payment to the owner of the property for cover the rent on a unit by unit basis. And then there's sponsor-based rental assistance, which rather than being tied to the project is tied to the sponsor of the project. And again, there's a lot of sort of very granular technical detail around these different kinds of rental assistance, which we can try and answer on the call or put in the Q&A. Some other things you can do around the housing side, you can pay for security deposits, first and last month's rent, some minor property damage, routine property management if you own the property, and you can be reimbursed for vacancies for up to 1 month when units turn over. Typically, you cannot use these dollars for a mortgage on a property you already own or major rehab on something that's damaged. Okay. So then on the services side, paying for staff, you can use CoC funds to pay for case managers, social workers, therapists and counselors, a large variety of different kinds of services staff, including salaries, benefits, mileage, and payroll tax. And then you can also pay costs for managers and supervisors. So the people who are hiring and supervising and managing those direct services staff. You can be reimbursed for the time staff spend reporting on client outcomes, a portion of accounting and audit services. So there's a little bit of gray in terms of whether things would be considered a support services cost versus an administrative cost. And the admin funds are capped at 10% of each new grant. So sometimes grantees feel like that's not actually adequate. So it's very important to kind of figure out what can fit under admin and what can fit under the services line item. Okay, moving on. A lot of programs use, they partner with other organizations to provide services. You can do that. You can use these dollars to enter into contracts. But you can also hire your own specialists. And so this is just some examples, not exhaustive. You can hire a housing navigator, you can have a psychotherapist on staff, literacy teacher, security guard. There's a pretty broad range of staff that you can pay the salaries for. And then these are just some examples of support services you can deliver yourself using HUD's dollars or contract for through a partner organization. And this is again, not an exhaustive list, but there's some of the more common things that people pay for in their programs. So this is important, and again, goes back to the differences between the two NOFOs. Under the regular NOFO, you cannot apply for services just by themselves for people who are experiencing homelessness. The services have to be connected to the housing that you're proposing to provide, whether it's permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, or transitional / rapid rehousing. They must be receiving housing from the program to get the services in the program. There's a few minor exceptions to that. But again, on the supplemental NOFO, you don't have to be providing housing at all. You could apply to do mobile outreach. You could apply to do employment services. You could apply to do any number of things for people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness without directly providing housing to them. Okay, so I'm going to just go through a few more of the administrative things and then we can start taking your questions. So one important consideration if you're thinking about the source is there are match requirements. They're fairly strict. And so just in terms of the size of match, for every $4 you get from HUD, minus your leasing costs, because HUD of course always has to make everything a little extra complicated. But if you add up all the things you're going to ask them to pay for minus the leasing, you need to spend another $1 from another source. Generally, can we get the next slide? This is often where projects get tripped up because the match has to be spent on the clients of the program that the HUD dollars is paying for. So it can't be clients of another program that you're running, and for costs that HUD would pay for. So it can't be that you take all your costs that HUD won't pay for and say you're paying for that and that's the match. It has to be things that HUD would pay for that you're using a different source to pay for. And so you have to really think about the best way to think about it is to really figure out what are all the costs involved in this program I want to do, and then where am I going to get a chunk of money to pay for some of it so that HUD isn't paying for 100% of it. You can use staff and volunteer time related to the CoC clients as match, as long as that's not being paid for by another HUD grant. And then at the end, again, just kind of reiterating some cautions about match. It has to pay for eligible CoC costs and clients. You can't use other CoC funds as match. There are a few other sources that statutorily can't be used as match. And then the other thing is it works out better for you if you can find cash match. You can use in-kind match, meaning the resources the dollars don't flow into your organization, but rather it's another organization that's providing donated services to your project. It's a lot higher burden to document that you're doing that. You have to have MOUs. There has to be a lot of tracking of the staff and volunteer time, or any donated goods and services. All has to be pretty extensively documented. So just be careful if you're thinking about in-kind match. And again, if it's in-kind, you still have to provide evidence that whatever was provided to clients of the project and were things that HUD would have paid for. Okay, these are just a few examples of match sources. CDBG is a good source, ESG. Again, we have some outdated California sources on here, which I apologize I didn't catch. I don't think Cash and Heap exist anymore, but HAP, which is what the state now mostly provides to communities to address homelessness, is a good source. And then there could be local, city, or county funding sources that you have. And private funding is another common source of match for CoC grants. Okay, keep going. I think we just have a couple more. So these list of things under other is a lot, and just sort of be aware of these considerations as you're thinking about whether this is the right funding source for you. I think, as we mentioned, the referrals into the project will come from coordinated entry. And that is a HUD requirement. It's a threshold requirement for all CoC dollars. There are also HUD requirements around Housing First, which have to do with not screening people out based on a variety of different kinds of barriers, and then also kind of whether you impose any, you have sort of policies on continuing participation that impose barriers to people being able to participate. There are timeliness requirements in terms of getting your project up and running, particularly if you're going to do anything with new construction, acquisition, or rehab. CoC grants have a lot of record keeping requirements. We already mentioned some of them around match. You also have to be part of the HMIS system and input client data into there. And then just generally taking any federal dollars brings with it a fairly high level of requirements around your financial systems, reporting, and audits. Okay.
I just wanted to mention something quickly here. We do recognize that these HUD CoC grants have a pretty high burden of administrative elements. And so something that the Continuum of Care has been talking about is wanting to provide some support to agencies who haven't run this type of grant before, maybe in future years. So I just wanted to mention, if you have thoughts about what would be helpful or what you would need, if you're thinking about capacity, to reach out on that. So wanted to mention that.
Okay, so the last things are just a couple slides about some things you should be thinking about as you're considering this source. So what are your goals? What do you want to accomplish with your project? What population are you planning to serve, and what needs do they have? Where are you thinking you want folks to live, and what supports would they need? How long will people stay in the program? Where do you think they'd be going when they leave your program? And then how does it fit with local priorities? And then the last set of questions, so those are sort of as you think about design, but then also capacity questions. So how much do you think the project would cost, and how much staff do you need, and how does that line up with how much money is available in the two different NOFOs? Can you find enough match? Are there partners you would need to make the project successful, and do you have relationships with them? Are you going to be able to get up and running fairly quickly after getting the award? And then do you have experience applying for and or managing federal grants? And I would just say that the application process is unfortunately somewhat burdensome with HUD. We try to make the local process not too complicated, but the process with HUD is a little complicated. And then of course, managing it once you have it is pretty burdensome. Next slide. And then we have some resources on the slides, and we'll also put the links to these into the chat, since we know you can't click on the slides. everything on here on this slide is also already on the Everyone Home webpage, I believe. And then there's another slide which has some additional kind of resources about recent planning efforts in Alameda County to give you some context around what is happening locally around reducing homelessness or ending homelessness. Okay, so then the last thing I'm just going to share is just some quick dates people should be aware of, and then we'll try and get to as many questions as we can. Go ahead to the next one. Okay, so on the regular NOFO, we'll talk more about this at the bidders conference, which is Tuesday the 16th. Normally HUD gives a 90-day response period on the regular NOFO. This year they've given us 60, so we have only 2/3 of the normal time. That means applications under the regular NOFO are going to have to come in super quickly, and we have no control over that whatsoever. So the local application deadline for the regular NOFO is going to be August 30th, which means from the bidders conference to the deadline is going to be 2 weeks. And then you'll receive a response to whether your project has been recommended to be put in the package by the 15th, and that application has to get to HUD by the 30th. And then the good news is on the supplemental NOFO, where there is more money for new projects and a wider range of projects. We have a little more time. That bidders conference will be the 23rd, and you'll have until September 20th to get your local applications together. Then they'll be rated and ranked, and you'll have a answer to whether your application is being recommended for funding by October 5th. And those applications have to get to HUD. The whole package goes to HUD October 20th. So as you're thinking about new projects, just be aware, if you want to try and come in under the regular NOFO, it's going to be super tight. There'll be a little bit more ability to pull your application together and get your match in order and think about your program design if you're going in under the supplemental side. So I'm going to just invite folks to raise their hands, and we'll try and answer as many raised hands as we can. And also Rachel's monitoring the chat, and we'll answer those questions as well as best we can. And anything we can't answer, we will answer in writing, and that will go up as quickly as we can do it. Probably not today, but early next week.
And Kate, for our first question, someone's asking, what is eSnaps? If you could give a little info.
Okay, so eSnaps is a federal, it's run by HUD. It is a federal application portal. So if you've ever applied for, I mean, actually a lot of local and state funders use these as well. So instead of like emailing them an application, there's a portal where you fill in all your information. So for HUD CoC, it is a system called eSnaps, and it's not the most user-friendly system, so it takes a little getting used to. The thing to know about CoC dollars is, so, and again, we'll cover more of this in the bidders conference, but to get the local continuum of care, which is coordinated by Everyone Home, runs a local competition. So to apply, you're going to have to fill out a locally designed application that asks for information about your project. That will get rated and ranked by a local NOFO committee. But then if you're selected to be in the package, actually, even if you're not selected to be in the package, in addition to doing that, you have to fill out HUD's application. And HUD's application is the eSnaps application. So you have to set up an account in their system, answer their questions. And so that's happening in parallel to the local process. I hope that answers the question.
And then a question from Kim about whether projects have to already be using HMIS to apply, or only if approved for the funding.
No, you don't have to already be in HMIS. As part of the local application, you'll get asked if you are planning, if you are willing to be in HMIS. It would be a threshold requirement, but you don't have to already be in.
And then someone's asking if it's possible to master lease a large home and then provide rooms.
Yeah, I think it would depend a little bit on the details of how you're going to do it. so we may have to answer with a little bit more detail after the call, but one of the general things to think about is that each participant has to have their own rental agreement or lease. So you would need to be able to figure out a way to create agreements with each person for their own space. So it makes it it's tricky if you have situations where people are sharing. But I would say it's not impossible to do a program in a house.
Great, and then we have a couple of more detailed questions, but someone asked if anyone knows when HUD will open applications and eSnaps, and we don't know quite yet. HUD said yesterday at some office hours that it would be in the next few days to next week, but we don't know for sure when eSnaps will be open. And then someone was asking about a safe parking program and whether that would fall under supportive services for the supplemental NOFO. I don't know, Kate, if you want to speak.
Yeah, I think depends a little bit on what the costs would be. So if you want to do a safe parking program and pay for the services associated with it, I think that I'm going to say provisionally yes, although I think we need to probably write up a more detailed answer about that. Again, you can't pay for emergency sheltering with this funding stream. So you couldn't like lease a building and then offer emergency shelter stays. And I know safe parking is not the same model, but I think to the extent that you're like securing a site, it might be complicated. But if you're just trying to deliver some services to folks for whom you're offering some kind of a safe place to park, that might be an eligible use. But I'm saying might, and we'll have to do a Q&A on that. I think HUD is getting a lot of questions about that, and I'm not sure that they've answered.
Like Kate's saying, the supplemental NOFO, it being so new, it takes a little research to try to figure some of these pieces out. There is an important question about the regular NOFO and acquisition, about the timing. So they're asking whether the property has to be purchased and then they would get reimbursed, or is it that the funding is used to help with the acquisition at the time of closing? I don't know if you can speak to that. I
don't know the answer to that question. We'll have to post an answer to that. I do know there's some specific timeliness requirements around the use of the dollars for acquisition, rehab, or new construction. But they're more related to getting when you have to start construction, if you're going to do construction. So we can post some of that information as well.
Sounds good. And then someone asked if the local application is available now, or if it's going to be open at the bidders conference, and I can answer that. It's not available just yet. It's coming soon, so that will be available. We'll talk about that at the bidders conferences. So just a reminder, there are two different bidders conference, one on the 16th for the regular and one on the 23rd for the supplemental NOFO. We have information on our website, and I'll drop that link again about that. And then someone else asked if it's possible to apply for both the regular and the supplemental NOFO this year.
Yes, so you can apply. You can essentially submit the same project under both. And because of the way the two processes are staggered, on the regular NOFO side, the rating and ranking panel is going to make its decisions by September 15th. So you would know the outcome of your application by the 15th. And then the local deadline on the unsheltered NOFO is the 20th. So there's a few days there. So if you know you got in on the regular NOFO side, you have that information to inform whether you want to go in on the supplemental side. You can also just go in under both. I don't think HUD has answered the question of what they would do if one project got HUD funding on both sides. And hopefully they'll issue some guidance around that. But there's no prohibition about submitting an application to both. And again, remember the unsheltered NOFO is very competitive. We have no idea if anything will be funded. So even if you put in a bonus project on the regular side and it goes to HUD in our package, there's no guarantee that would be funded, and there's no guarantee it would be funded on the supplemental side. So if the project fits under both, you can put it under both.
We've answered a lot of the questions that are in the chat. We'll definitely, if I missed yours, we'll definitely follow up. But I wanted to see what other questions there might be. And you can also raise your hand and unmute if you want to ask questions that way.
I have a quick question. We are current CoC recipients in San Francisco CoC, and we're going to be renewing a HUD contract that got transferred to us in Alameda. And if this is more appropriate for bidders, please let me know. Does it, since we're renewing 2 different CoC, well, 4 contracts total across 2 CoCs, does there have to be any separation with the match sources that we use? Does that matter at all?
I think it's probably a conversation. It's not really a bidders conference thing. I think it's a
CoC thing.
More of a TA question. So if you could,
okay.
Yeah, I think, and Rachel, we probably should put the info at email in the chat. When we get to the bidders conference, we'll be sharing, but all the questions for the CoC about your specific project or your specific grant should go to info@everyonehome, and then one of us will respond. But that just, yeah, I can't, off the top of my head, I'm not sure what the answer to that question is.
Thank you. No problem.
And I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat right now. We'll give you a moment, and definitely feel free to raise hands. There's one question left in the chat. It might be a little bit more specific though about whether you'd need to apply for ALCO vendor pool in order to access the funding.
Oh, I don't think so. We will give a definite answer to that in the written Q&A because this is not Alameda County dollars. I can't think of a reason you'd have to be in the vendor pool, but we will get a definite answer to that.
And we have about 3 minutes left, so we can handle 1 or 2 more questions. In the meantime, I just wanted to say we really appreciate you being here and your interest in this process, and we do encourage you to come to one or both of the bidders conferences that you might be interested in. Again, the regular NOFO is on Tuesday the 16th from 10 to 12, and the supplemental NOFO is Tuesday the 23rd from 12 to 2. And I put the chat a couple times. It's the most recent link. That's where you can go, and then there are links to register for each of those on Zoom. The other thing is we've dropped the email in here, so definitely if you have some more of the technical assistance questions, please email us there and we can follow up. And people have asked about the slides, and so I wanted to mention that we'll be posting that to Everyone Home's website, as well as we will send it out to anyone who registered on Zoom for this session. But if you didn't register, you know, if you're you joined some other way or you're joining a couple people in a room, send us your email or just check our website. Might be the easiest way to find the materials. Anything else, Katie, Kate? Oh, there is a good question about, are the bidders conference mandatory?
No, and again, because the timeline was a little rushed, so we appreciate people don't have a huge amount of time to get things on their calendar. We strongly encourage attendance at the bidders conference, particularly if you're planning to do a renewal. But if you're planning a new project, we are going to walk through the application questions and forms and process. And if you participated last year, you know that Homebase was the consultant and they have a kind of a custom application portal they use, which we're not using this year. So it's going to be, because Homebase isn't providing the TA. So if you could, if at all possible, we would encourage folks to come to the bidders conference for the relevant NOFO.
And there's a question, if you attend the 16th, the 23rd will be similar. I'd say to that, there is going to be some major differences because the regular and supplemental, as we've been talking about today, have different eligible costs, and there's going to be different application questions. And so that's something to know.
Yeah, the other thing I would say, if you have a grant that you want to renew and you really don't have any interest in doing a new application, there's no need to go to the one on the 23rd. But yeah, there is completely different information around new projects for the regular versus the supplemental.
Someone asked who's going to be providing the TA. So Kate Bristol here is going to be providing some of the TA, and then everyone home staff as well assists with that.
Yeah, if you have been, in 2021, Homebase provided TA. In 2020, there was no competition. In 2019 and prior, everyone home basically provided all the TA in-house. So we're going a little bit back towards the old way of doing things. And then I'm providing technical assistance as well.
So do we submit info@everyonehome.org is for TA questions?
That is right. And we'll forward it to the right people to get you an answer.
Oh, thank you.
And we are at time, so I think we will wrap up here, but really thank you for your time, and nice to spend this time with you all, and we hope to see you in the future.